The man I called my brother looked at me with the triumphant pity of a predator. His words were the first blow, cutting clean through the raw edge of my grief. "Anna, darling," Gary said, his voice slick with fake concern. "You've been through too much. The past 5 years. The stress of Mom's illness. The emotional drain. You need a vacation." He stood next to my father. Dad sat in his armchair, frail and lost in the fog of his wife's funeral just 3 days prior. My brother used our father as a human shield. "Gary will take over as executor," Dad whispered. His voice was weak, barely a sound. "He is a lawyer. He understands these things. It is what your mother would have wanted, Anna, for you to rest." The punch landed squarely in my chest. My mother, my amazing, strong mother, had entrusted me with her final affairs. I was her daughter. I was her caregiver. Gary, the brother who skipped holidays and ignored her phone calls, had spent 48 hours systematically manipulating our grieving father. The hastily typed amendment to the will sat on the coffee table. It stripped me of the executor role and its substantial commission. This was not just a financial loss. It was the complete, arrogant erasure of my sacrifice. Gary was claiming I was emotionally incompetent because I was actually mourning. "You are right, Dad," I replied, forcing the words out. My voice was steady. "Gary understands these things." I gave Gary a look that promised a long, cold winter. "Congratulations on your new legal liability, Gary." He laughed, the sound hollow and sharp. "Don't be dramatic, Anna. It is a formality. The cash is the easy part." I saw his fatal mistake. He saw the title, the commission, the power. He did not see the work. He did not see the risk. He never looked past the surface. He was profoundly lazy. He wanted the prize without the effort. My initial plan to manage the estate flawlessly had been brutally destroyed. But the moment he called it the easy part, my counterattack began to form. I knew my mother's portfolio was complex. I knew the specific, highly technical federal tax filings were due immediately. Gary knew none of it. I walked out of the study. The tears of grief I had been holding back were replaced by a cold, analytical resolve. I sent him an email with the subject line: "Executor checklist, priority federal filings, 72-hour deadline." The body was short and purely technical. It listed the federal estate tax return, requiring a full valuation of complex, non-liquid assets. It stressed personal criminal liability for the executor for failure to file. It also mentioned state-specific inheritance tax declarations. I attached a government PDF detailing the severe penalties, including potential jail time and crippling fines. 30 minutes later, my phone remained silent. I kept drinking my tea. Gary had tried to silence my grief with a lie. I was about to turn his stolen title into a ticking legal time bomb. Gary found me in the kitchen, pretending to clean the coffee machine. His face was pale. His veneer of smug competence had evaporated. "What is that email, Anna?" he hissed, slamming his phone onto the countertop. "You are trying to scare me. Those deadlines are not real." "They are real," I replied, my voice a monotone. "They were real when Mom signed the will 5 years ago. They were real yesterday when you convinced Dad to sign the amendment. They are very real now." He sputtered in rage. "You handled this for years. You never mentioned criminal liability." "I handled it because I understood it. You took over because you said it was easy. Now you own the liability. Gary, it is called fiduciary duty. You are personally responsible for every missing decimal point." I watched him struggle. His professional ego clashed violently with the administrative dread I knew he felt. He had told the entire extended family he was taking over the financial heavy lifting. He could not admit he was defeated by paperwork. "I will just call Finch," he muttered, referring to the family's estate attorney. "He will smooth it out for a fellow attorney." Finch requires a complete handover of the prior executor's file before he can formally advise the new executor. I recited. It is in his retainer agreement. It is protocol. He looked like a child caught stealing cookies. I had the knowledge he desperately needed. Without my 3 perfectly organized binders of my mother's history, Gary would be estimating valuations and guaranteeing penalties. I would not rush to help him. I would let him learn the full cost of his greed. Later that evening, the family gathered for a quiet dinner. Gary put on a theatrical performance for my father. I am talking to my tax partners. Dad, he announced loudly, tapping his phone dramatically. The estate tax filings are complicated, but do not worry. I have it under control. This is the heavy lifting Anna simply was not equipped for. I sent a second, highly technical email. I deliberately blind copied my father so he would only see the subject line, making the email look legitimate. Subject: urgent clarification on Form 706 penalties. Personal criminal liability confirmation. I wrote just confirming that, as the new executor, you are aware that failure to file Form 706 accurately by the deadline automatically triggers a mandatory audit and places personal criminal liability on the signatory Brew 6. Gary's hand started shaking as he read it. He quickly pushed his plate away and excused himself, stammering something about a critical client call. He was calling Google, desperately searching for the tax codes I had referenced. He tried to appear competent, but he was a terrified little boy. He had put his own freedom at risk for a commission check. Gary's predictable next move was to call Mr. Finch, the estate lawyer. He assumed that because they shared the title Esquire, Finch would bypass the rules. I had prepared for this. I called Mr. Finch earlier. I did not ask him to betray Gary. I simply asked him to enforce the firm's standard protocol strictly, and by the book for the new executor. Gary marched into the study again, phone to his ear. Finch, I need you to open the files. Now. I have these deadlines Anna set up. I stayed close by, calmly watering a ficus tree. I heard Finch's answer. Cool and professional. Mr. Caldwell, I respect your urgency, but I require the full file handover from the prior executor, Ms. Anna Caldwell. Additionally, per firm policy regarding new executors of complex estates, you must schedule and attend an executor competency assessment meeting with Miss Priest, Caldwell, and myself. I cannot assume legal responsibility for the tax filing without this process. Gary slammed the phone down. His face was a mask of furious desperation. You did this, he roared. The competency assessment, the handover. What is this? A loyalty test. No. Gary, I said, putting down the watering can. It is protocol, and since you are the executor, you need to sign the document confirming you received the 3 binders of financial history. I cannot hand them over without a formal receipt, or I assume the liability. I was using my meticulous nature, my competence, which they had always dismissed as mere bookkeeping, as a solid, unassailable wall. He could not bypass me. He had to face the reality that he had stolen the hardest job in the family. I was the only gatekeeper to the solution. He was forced to admit to my father that evening that the process was more complex than anticipated. His initial claim of easy money was now a lie. He had to schedule a contentious, mandatory, 8-hour handover meeting with me the next morning. It was time for him to physically face the price of his greed. I arrived at my father's house precisely on time for the handover meeting. I was dressed in a sharp navy blazer and carried a briefcase. I was utterly professional. Gary was hungover, irritable, and dressed in a wrinkled shirt. I did not bring solutions. I brought problems. On the table, I placed 3 heavy, matching binders, the Caldwell trust documents, the mother's investment portfolio, and federal and state tax history. They were flawless, organized, and indexed. Gary sneered. All right. Let's make this fast. Just tell me what numbers to plug into the software. I opened my notebook and ignored him. Gary, as the executor, you must first explain to me your strategy for managing the non-liquid assets and the specific requirements of the mother's long-term care insurance trust. Without a clear strategy, I cannot, in good conscience, hand over the primary documentation that affects the father's long-term care. I fired off questions about tax basis valuation, fiduciary income distribution, and the legal distinction between the various trust accounts. These were intimate details of my mother's finances that Gary could not possibly know. He tried to bluff, making grand, vague statements that revealed his total legal ignorance. We will just liquidate what we need to meet the deadlines. It is simple. Liquidation requires proper documentation for the IRS, which you do not have. I stated calmly, tapping the binders. If you liquidate without knowing the tax basis, you expose the entire estate, and yourself, to crippling capital gains tax. His face drained of color. He was afraid of the numbers I represented. I spent an hour asking only questions he couldn't answer. I forced him to confess, through his stumbling, that he had not read the will, let alone the trust documents. Finally, I closed my briefcase. My time as a consultant is up. Gary, here is the file. And here is your signed receipt confirming you have received the full legal burden of the Caldwell estate. Good luck with the federal deadlines. I pushed the 3 heavy binders toward him. The physical sight of the 3 binders, combined with the 8-page list of unanswered legal questions I left on top, was the perfect psychological weapon. The prize had become a crushing punishment. I walked out, leaving him utterly alone, surrounded by the crushing reality of the work he had stolen. Gary was completely desperate. He was mentally broken by the 3 binders, and desperately needed cash before the federal deadline hit. His desperation turned his gaze toward the family's most sentimental asset, the small, beloved vacation cabin that my mother adored. He went to my father and spun a desperate lie. Dad, I hate to do this, but the tax situation is dire. Anna's poor management left us with no choice. I need you to sign papers authorizing the immediate sale of the cabin to cover the tax liabilities. We have to simplify the estate. My father called me, his voice trembling. He says he has to sell it. Anna, to avoid the IRS. I did not argue with Gary. I did not confront him. I went straight to the extended family and weaponized social sentiment. I sent a calm, understated text message to the entire family network, aunts, uncles, and cousins. I am organizing an urgent, quiet memorial for Mom at the cabin tonight, at 7. Please join us if you can. It might be our last time to say goodbye to her favorite place. At 6 o'clock, Gary arrived at my father's house, clutching the sales papers. He expected a quick signature. Instead, he found 30 members of the extended family gathered in the living room. They were all standing, quiet, all looking at him with deep, judgmental eyes. My father was surrounded by his sisters and nieces, all ready to share one last story about my mother at the cabin. The atmosphere was thick with silent, collective disapproval. Gary could not move. He could not speak. He could not ask my grieving father, surrounded by emotional sentinels, to sign papers authorizing the immediate sale of his wife's cherished memory. He folded instantly. He shoved the sales papers back into his briefcase and mumbled an excuse about an unforeseen legal delay. The cabin was safe, and Gary, out of time, money, and social capital. He knew he had been utterly defeated. He was exposed, humiliated, and fully cornered by a tax deadline only I knew how to navigate. I knew he would call me within the hour, begging for terms. The phone rang precisely an hour after Gary's social humiliation at the cabin. I let it ring twice before answering, letting him steep in his fear. Anna. His voice was tight and raw. This is ridiculous. You know how to fix this tax mess. I will walk away entirely. Just name your price. That is a very reckless threat. Gary, I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. Walking away entirely means the criminal liability and the fines get dumped onto Dad. And then potentially back onto me as the next logical executor. Is that what you want the family to know? He had not thought that far ahead. The coward never does. No, he finally admitted, his voice a rasp. I want out. I will give it back. Just tell me your terms. You win. My terms are simple, I stated. Purely transactional. I will take back the role I was meant to have, in exchange for absorbing the legal exposure you created and fixing the filing catastrophe. I require 3 things. First, the executor commission, wired to my personal account immediately. Second, an additional $50,000 from your own savings to cover the consulting I have already done. Third, you must sign a notarized document stating you voluntarily resigned due to incompetence. Gary hissed into the phone. Incompetence. That is humiliating. I am a lawyer. A lawyer who almost gave his grieving father a federal tax audit because he could not read a filing deadline. The document will only be shown to father if he explicitly asks for the reason behind your sudden retreat. Otherwise, the official story will be that you were called away on urgent client business. Take it or leave it. The deadline is tomorrow morning. The fear of criminal tax liability outweighed his humiliation. Fine. He spat. Send the documents. I will sign. Within 90 minutes. The wire transfer confirmation landed in my inbox, followed by the image of the notarized document. I had not only regained my rightful position, but I had bought back my mother's legacy for the price of Gary's desperate shame. With the executor role safely back in my hands, I immediately set about fixing the tax nightmare Gary had created. I did not immediately expose him to the father. I waited until I knew he would try one last pathetic social attack. True to his psychological profile, Gary attempted to salvage his dignity. He went to Dad and spun a final half-truth that I had blackmailed him into signing the documents because I wanted the commission for myself, confirming his original narrative that I was too fixated on money. My father looked at me with confusion. Gary expected Dad to quietly resent me for my apparent greed. I did not deny the accusation. I waited until my father was alone in his study. I walked in, carrying only the items Gary had abandoned. I did not show my father the notarized resignation. Instead, I quietly placed the 3 heavy, color-coded binders of the estate documentation, the Caldwell Trust documents, the mother's investment portfolio, and federal and state tax history directly onto my father's desk. Next to them, I placed Gary's complex, handwritten 8-page list of the legal questions he had demanded. I answer. Gary asked me to handle these immediately. Dad, I said, my voice gentle and factual. He said he was called away on urgent client business. My father did not need a word of explanation. He looked at the sheer volume of organized, tedious, and highly technical work symbolized by the 3 binders. He looked at the 8-page list of legal riddles that Gary was supposed to have mastered as a lawyer. In that single, clear moment, the entire truth clicked for him. He saw the mountain of work. He realized Gary had stolen the role for the commission, then quit. When he realized the sheer magnitude of the work involved, my father spent the rest of the day staring at the binders. He never mentioned Gary's resignation again. A few days later, a cold, formal letter was delivered to Gary's home, drafted by Mr. Finch. It informed Gary that his future allowance was terminated, and he was forbidden from involving himself in the family finances again. Gary, humiliated and financially cut off, desperately needed to save face. He intensified his social attack, spreading a vicious rumor to the extended family that I had been greedy, and had used my knowledge of the tax laws to extort him out of his rightful commission. I did not fight the rumor in private. I weaponized my competence on a public stage. With my father's approval, I sent out a polite, family-wide email update, specifically crafted for maximum psychological impact. Subject: estate update filing complete. Penalties averted. Dear family, I am relieved to report that the complex federal estate tax filings Form 706 were completed just hours before the criminal penalty deadline. It was a massive undertaking, but the Caldwell estate is secure, and we have successfully navigated the immediate, high-risk financial liability associated with the mother's specific trust funds. Anna. The family instantly understood the unwritten truth. Gary was not extorted. He was incompetent and had almost bankrupted the family with a federal filing error. I asked it. The dismissed daughter had saved them all with my technical knowledge, clocking in just before the criminal penalty deadline that Gary had ignored. Gary's social isolation was immediate and profound. He was not just disliked. He was now seen as a dangerous, ignorant financial risk to the family's wealth. His few remaining social connections evaporated, leaving him completely alone with his shame and his rapidly deepening financial crisis. Gary, now desperate for cash, attempted a final act of fraud to save his crumbling law practice. He submitted an outrageous, fraudulent invoice to the estate for legal consultation services he allegedly accrued during his 3-day tenure as executor. Expected me, as executor, to pay a small settlement to make him quietly disappear. I did not negotiate. I did not pay. I took the invoice and the cover letter Gary had sent, and I forwarded them both directly to the State Bar Ethics Committee with a single procedural email. Subject: executor's legal duty to report suspected fraudulent billing practices. I wrote that as the executor of the estate, I was legally required to report any potential misuse of estate funds, and the invoice submitted by Gary Caldwell, Esquire, appeared highly suspicious and unsubstantiated. I was simply fulfilling my fiduciary duty. The bar committee immediately opened an official inquiry into Gary's law firm. This was the public death knell for his career. The few clients who hadn't abandoned him after the tax incident instantly fled. The cost of mounting a legal defense against the ethics committee was the final nail in the coffin. Gary's law firm collapsed entirely. He was stripped of his license, losing the only professional identity he had left. He lost his income, his prestige, and his home. The financial power he had desperately sought was the same force that completely destroyed him. I completed my duties as executor flawlessly. The estate was settled. My father was secure, and the mother's legacy was preserved. Gary, now unemployed and facing personal bankruptcy, sent one final, pleading, self-pitying letter to my father. He blamed me for the bar inquiry and his ruined career, begging for a final small sum out of sympathy to save his home. My father, now fully recovered and completely clear-headed about the character of his son, called us both together for a final meeting in his study, the same study where Gary had stolen my role 6 months earlier. Gary, my father said, his voice quiet. Final. I have changed my will one last time. Gary's eyes lit up with desperate hope, believing his pity plea had worked. Your mother and I raised you to be responsible. Dad continued, looking at the floor, and Anna showed me that you only chase money, not duty. You nearly cost us everything. Dad looked up at Gary. I have removed you from the will entirely. You will not receive a single cent of my estate. Gary gasped, the shock silencing him completely. However, Dad continued, looking at me, I have established a trust fund for any children you may have in the future. He paused. That trust will be managed entirely by Anna. As the trustee, the blow landed with the force of an avalanche. Gary was not only disinherited, the only potential path to his family's wealth, the money designated for his own future bloodline, was put under my complete, permanent control. He would never be able to touch it, use it, or manipulate it. His greedy grab for the executor role had resulted in my total, final control over his financial future. I walked out of the study and away from my brother for the last time. My mother's legacy was safe. My father was secure. And I had achieved something far greater than money the total. Crushing validation of my worth and my intellect. The executor's justice was complete.